The vast emptiness of space around the Kepler 442 system had been quiet for decades. The Zephyrian Collective controlled this region of the galaxy with an iron fist, their technology so advanced that most species avoided their territory entirely. Their defensive grid was a masterpiece of engineering that had taken 300 years to perfect. Massive energy barriers surrounded each planet like invisible walls, capable of stopping asteroids the size of small moons. Automated sentinel ships patrolled the darkness between worlds, their numbers reaching into the millions. Admiral Hayon stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical displays with calm confidence. His pale blue skin bore the silver markings of high command, and his forearms moved with practiced grace as he reviewed the day's reports. The fortress worlds under his protection had never fallen to any enemy. Their weapons could destroy entire fleets, and their shields had never been breached by any known technology. It was during the morning watch when everything changed. A junior officer named Kethler called out from the sensor station, his voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than alarm. "Admiral, we have unknown contacts approaching from the outer rim. They appear to be from a species calling themselves humans." Admiral Hayon turned to study the main display screen as the computer generated images of the approaching vessels. What he saw almost made him laugh out loud. The ships were primitive beyond belief, constructed from basic metals and powered by simple chemical engines. They had no energy weapons that the sensors could detect, no exotic matter drives that could bend space and time, and no quantum disruptors that could tear holes in reality itself. "How many vessels are we tracking?" Admiral Hayon asked, his voice carrying amusement. 47 ships, Admiral. They're maintaining a steady approach vector toward our outer perimeter." The other officers on the bridge began to murmur among themselves, sharing jokes about the foolishness of these unknown aliens. In recent months, they had encountered several species that had tried to challenge Zephyrian dominance. Each time, a simple demonstration of their superior firepower had been enough to send the intruders fleeing back to whatever backward worlds they came from. "Send them the standard warning," Admiral Hayon ordered, waving one of his hands dismissively. "Tell them they are entering protected space and must turn back immediately or face the consequences." The communications officer transmitted the message, but the human ships continued their approach without any response. They maintained their course and speed, their primitive engines leaving visible exhaust trails that made them easy to track. On the sensors, far away in the depths of space, aboard the lead human vessel, designated U.S. Determination, Admiral Minho studied his own tactical displays with intense concentration. He was a compact man with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades spent in command. His uniform was simple and practical, bearing none of the elaborate decorations that marked high-ranking officers and other species militaries around him. His crew worked with quiet efficiency. They had been traveling for months to reach this system, and every person aboard knew the importance of their mission. The humans had studied everything they could about Zephyrian technology and tactics. Through careful observation and intelligence gathering. "Any response to their warning, sir?" asked Lieutenant Gina, the ship's communications officer. No response. Minho replied firmly. "We maintain radio silence as planned. They need to see us as primitive and predictable for as long as possible." The human fleet had been designed to appear crude and unsophisticated to alien sensors.
Oh, yes.
Their ships were built from basic materials and powered by conventional engines that any advanced species would consider laughably outdated, but hidden within. Their simple exteriors were weapons and systems that had been tested in countless battles across human space. "Status on the cargo deployment?" Minho asked. "All pods are ready for release, Admiral," reported his tactical officer. "The crews are standing by for deployment?" The cargo pods were perhaps the most crucial element of the human strategy. Each one was designed to look like a simple supply container, the kind that civilian merchants used to transport goods between star systems. To Zephyrian sensors, they would appear as harmless debris, not worth targeting with their sophisticated weapons systems. But inside each pod were 3 human soldiers and enough nuclear warheads to devastate a small city, back on the Zephyrian command vessel. Admiral Hayon was growing impatient with the human ship's continued approach. They had ignored multiple warnings and were now dangerously close to the outer defensive perimeter. His sentinel ships were moving into attack formations, their weapon systems charging with energy that made the surrounding space glow with heat. "Admiral," Kethler called out from his station. "The human vessels are releasing cargo of some kind. The objects appear to be standard supply containers." Admiral Hayon glanced at the new contacts appearing on his tactical display. The containers were small and showed no signs of weapons or propulsion systems. Most likely, the humans were jettisoning excess supplies to make their ships lighter and faster for the battle they were about to lose. "Ignore the containers," he ordered with a dismissive gesture. "Focus all targeting systems on the ships themselves. Prepare to show these primitives why the Zephyrian Collective is not to be challenged." The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Both species thought they knew about warfare in the galaxy. The first shots of the battle lit up the darkness of space like a deadly fireworks display. Thousands of Zephyrian Sentinel ships moved forward in perfect formation, their sleek hulls gleaming under the light of distant stars. These automated vessels had been designed for one purpose: to destroy any threat to the Collective before it could reach their homeworlds. Admiral Hayon watched from his command bridge as the Sentinel fleet engaged the human vessels. Brilliant. Streams of plasma fire erupted from the Zephyrian ships, each beam hot enough to melt through solid rock. The energy weapons created dazzling light shows as they struck the crude metal hulls of the human ships. But the aliens' primitive armor held together better than expected. "Direct hits on multiple targets," reported the tactical officer. "But their hulls are absorbing more damage than our computers predicted." Admiral Hoon frowned slightly. The human ships were tougher than they looked, but it was only a matter of time before their primitive defenses failed completely. He watched as the humans returned fire with what appeared to be simple kinetic weapons, metal projectiles fired at high speed rather than energy beams. "Pathetic," he muttered to himself. "He might as well be throwing rocks at our shields." But something strange was happening on the battlefield. The human ships were not behaving like any enemy the Zephyrians had faced before. Instead of trying to retreat or form defensive positions, they were moving forward in complex patterns that seemed to make no tactical sense. Captain Gina stood in the command center of her vessel, the EU's resilience, watching the battle unfold on multiple screens. Around her, she was a small woman with sharp eyes and quick hands, and she had been studying Zephyrian tactics for months in preparation for this moment. Her ship was part of the human fleet's tactical command group, responsible for coordinating the movements of all 47 vessels. "Alpha Group, begin Pattern 7. She spoke into her communications headset. "Beta Group, shift to Formation Delta. Gamma Group, prepare for scatter deployment." The human ships began to move in ways that confused the Zephyrian targeting systems. It would suddenly change direction, spin in place, or accelerate in seemingly random patterns. But there was nothing random about their movements. Each ship was following a carefully planned sequence that had been practiced countless times during their long journey to this system. "Why are they moving like that?" asked one of the Zephyrian officers, staring at the tactical display in confusion. "Their movement patterns make no sense," replied another. "They should be trying to maximize their firepower or protect their most important ships." Admiral Haynes studied the human formations with growing concern. His advanced computer systems were designed to predict enemy movements based on logical, tactical principles. But the humans seemed to be operating according to completely different rules. Their ships moved like a school of fish or a flock of birds, each vessel responding to the others in ways that created patterns too complex for artificial intelligence to understand. The real surprise came when the human ships began to fire their weapons. Instead of aiming directly at the Zephyrian vessels, they were shooting at empty space points where no enemy ships were located. The Zephyrian officers initially thought this was proof of the humans' primitive targeting systems, but then something unexpected happened. Admiral called out the sensor operator, his voice filled with alarm. "Our lead squadron is flying directly into the human weapons fire." Admiral Hayen stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The human ships had somehow predicted exactly where his Sentinel vessels would be several seconds in the future. Their kinetic weapons were firing at points in space that seemed empty. But by the time the metal projectiles reached those locations, Zephyrian ships were there to meet them. Captain Gina smiled grimly as she watched the enemy vessels fly directly into her carefully planned firing solutions. Human tactical doctrine was based on thousands of years of warfare against other humans, and it had taught them to think several moves ahead of their opponents, while the Zephyrians relied on their advanced technology and superior firepower. Humans had learned to use prediction, timing, and coordination to overcome stronger enemies. All ships, execute Phase 2, she ordered. Begin evasive maneuvers and continue firing at predicted intercept points. The human fleet began to move even more erratically, their ships weaving through space in patterns that seemed to defy logic. But each movement was calculated to place them in the best position to fire at where the Zephyrian ships would be, not where they were. The aliens' advanced shields could stop direct hits from the human weapons, but they were not designed to protect against attacks that came from unexpected angles. Within an hour of the battle's start, the outer Sentinel network was in complete chaos. Zephyrian ships were colliding with each other as they tried to avoid human weapons fire, their artificial intelligence systems unable to predict the next move in the complex dance of battle. Some vessels were spinning out of control, their guidance systems damaged by kinetic impacts they had never been designed to handle. How is this possible? Admiral Hayne demanded, his forearms gesturing wildly at the tactical displays. They have primitive weapons and no advanced technology. Our shields should be stopping everything they throw at us. But the humans were not trying to overpower the Zephyrian defenses. Instead, they were using tactics that turned the aliens' own strength against them, creating a battle unlike anything the collective had ever experienced. The destruction of the outer Sentinel network sent shockwaves through the Zephyrian command structure, but Admiral Hayne was far from defeated. The collective had spent centuries building defenses that went far beyond simple patrol ships. Deep within the Kepler 442 system, 3 massive fortress worlds waited like sleeping giants, their surfaces covered with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. The fortress world of Keftai was the crown jewel of Zephyrian military engineering. Its surface bristled with thousands of massive particle beam arrays, each one capable of striking targets at distances measured in light minutes. The planet's core had been hollowed out and replaced with fusion reactors that could power weapons strong enough to crack moons in half. From orbit, the world looked like a metal sphere covered in spikes, each spike being a gun barrel larger than most starships. Activate all planetary defense systems, Admiral Hayone ordered from his command station. Show these humans what real firepower looks like. The fortress worlds came alive with deadly energy. Massive turrets rotated on their mountings, tracking the approaching human fleet with sensors that could detect a single ship from halfway across the solar system. The particle beam arrays began to charge, drawing power from the planet's core until the very air around them crackled with electricity. Warning lights flashed across the surface as automated systems prepared to unleash destruction on a scale that few species had ever witnessed. On the bridge of the UES Determination, Admiral Minho watched the energy readings spike as the fortress worlds powered up their weapons. He had expected this moment, but seeing the raw power of the Zephyrian defenses still made him pause. A single shot from those planetary guns could vaporize his entire flagship. All ships, begin cargo deployment, he ordered calmly. Execute plan, Charlie. The human fleet began to release thousands of small objects that scattered across the system like seeds thrown into a strong wind. To Zephyrian sensors, they looked like simple supply containers or escape pods, the kind of debris that merchant ships might jettison when under attack. The objects were too small to be considered threats. The Fortress World's targeting systems were designed to focus on large ships and weapons platforms. Inside one of these seemingly harmless pods, Lieutenant Hannah checked her equipment one final time. She was a compact woman with steady hands and eyes that had seen too many battles. Around her, 2 other soldiers made their own preparations in the cramped space that would be their home for the next several hours. Sergeant Doyan's status report, she said into her communications headset. All systems green, Lieutenant, came the reply from the pod's senior enlisted soldier. Nuclear warheads are armed and ready. We're good to go. The pod they occupied was one of thousands spreading across the Kepler 442 system. Each one contained a three-person crew and enough nuclear weapons to devastate a small city. The pods were designed to look like harmless debris, but they were actually sophisticated weapons platforms that could operate independently for days or weeks. On the surface of HFY, Zephyrian technicians monitored their sensors as the human fleet approached. The massive particle beam arrays were fully charged and ready to fire. The Fortress World's commander, General Vextar, stood in his underground command center, watching the tactical displays with satisfaction. "Begin firing sequence," he ordered. "Target the largest human vessels first." The Fortress World's guns erupted in a display of raw power that lit up the entire system. Beams of concentrated energy lanced out across space, each one carrying enough force to shatter asteroids. The first volley struck the human fleet with devastating accuracy, and several ships disappeared in brilliant flashes of light. But the human response was not what the Zephyrians expected. Instead of retreating or trying to fight back with their primitive weapons, the human fleet began to spread out across the system. Their ships moved in seemingly random directions, making themselves harder to target with the massive planetary guns. "Sir," called out a sensor operator on HFY. "We're detecting small objects throughout the system. They appeared to be debris from the human ships." General Vextar glanced at the sensor readings dismissively. "Ignore them. Focus on the main fleet." But the small objects were not debris. They were Lieutenant Hannah's pods, and thousands of others like them, each one moving silently through space. Toward predetermined targets? The pods used tiny thrusters to adjust their course, guided by human soldiers who had trained for this exact mission. "We're approaching the first defense platform," Sergeant Do Yan reported from his position at the pod's controls. "Range is 2,000 kilometers in closing." Lieutenant Hannah activated the pod's targeting systems, which were far more advanced than they appeared. The nuclear warheads they carried were not the crude weapons that most species used, but sophisticated devices that could be programmed to detonate at precise locations and times. "All pods, this is command," came Admiral Minho's voice over the communication system. "Begin final approach to your targets. Execute on my mark." Across the system, thousands of small pods began their final approach to Zephyrian defense platforms, weapon stations, and fortress installations. The alien sensors had dismissed them as harmless debris, but they were about to learn that humans had turned the art of deception into a deadly science. The Fortress Worlds were about to face an attack unlike anything they had ever experienced. Not from massive ships and powerful weapons, but from small, determined teams of soldiers who had learned to fight against impossible odds. The explosions began simultaneously across the Kepler 442 system. As thousands of human pods reached their targets, nuclear fire bloomed like deadly flowers against the metal surfaces of Zephyrian defense platforms. Each detonation carefully timed to cause maximum damage to critical systems. The Fortress Worlds, which had seemed invincible just hours before, suddenly found themselves under attack from every direction at once. Admiral Haynes stood frozen on his command bridge, watching in horror as his tactical displays showed one defensive position after another going dark. Red warning lights flashed across every screen as damage reports flooded in from across the system. His perfect defensive grid was collapsing like a house of cards, and he could not understand how it was happening. "Report," he shouted to his officers, his forearms gesturing wildly at the chaos around him. "Unknown explosions across all sectors," replied his tactical officer, his voice shaking with confusion. "We're losing contact with defense platforms, weapon stations, and sensor arrays. The humans are somehow attacking everything at once." But Admiral Hayne could not accept what he was seeing. These primitive aliens with their crude metal ships and basic weapons should not have been able to penetrate even the outer defenses, let alone destroy installations that had been built to withstand planet-killing weapons. The answer to his confusion was playing out on dozens of Zephyrian stations across the system. After the nuclear explosions had torn holes in the alien defenses, human soldiers began boarding operations that showed just how different these two species really were. "Commander." Seojin pulled himself through the twisted wreckage of a Zephyrian command station, his magnetic boots allowing him to walk on any surface in the zero-gravity environment. Behind him, a team of human soldiers moved with fluid grace through the damaged corridors, their simple equipment working perfectly in conditions that would have challenged the most advanced alien technology. The commander was a tall man with calloused hands and scars on his face that told the story of countless battles. His uniform was practical and worn, bearing none of the decorative elements that marked high-ranking officers and other species. Militaries. In his hands, he carried a basic toolkit that contained nothing more sophisticated than wrenches, cutting torches, and repair materials. Section 7 is secure, reported one of his soldiers through the communication system. We've got control of the main power grid. Good, Seojin replied, examining the damage to a critical junction box. Start working on the secondary systems. Need the station operational in 20 minutes. What happened next would be talked about in Zephyrian military academies for generations to come. Commander Seojin began repairing the battle damage to the alien station using nothing but his basic tools and an understanding of technology that seemed to come from pure instinct. He rerouted power cables, bypassed damaged circuits, and jury-rigged solutions that should not have worked but somehow did, in a corner of the damaged corridor. Zephyrian engineer named Kolvek watched the human commander work with growing amazement and terror. Alien had been captured when the humans boarded his station, and now he could only stare as these primitive beings accomplished things that should have required teams of specialists and advanced equipment. This is impossible, Kolvek whispered to himself. He's using basic tools to repair systems that took our best engineers months to design. Commander Seojin looked up from his work, noticing the alien's frightened expression. Problem solved, he said simply, activating the repaired systems. The lights in the corridor flickered back to life, and the station's artificial gravity began working again. Kolvek's forearms, which trembled as he watched the human commander move on to the next damaged section. The alien engineer had spent decades learning to work with the most advanced technology in the galaxy. But this primitive human was making repairs that Kolvek himself could not have managed with a full toolkit and a team of assistants. You don't understand, Kolvek said, his voice barely above a whisper. Those systems are too complex for basic tools. You need advanced scanners, quantum processors, and specialized equipment that takes years to learn how to use. Commander? Seojin paused in his work and looked at the alien engineer with something that might have been pity. We learned a long time ago that fancy tools break when you need them most. Basic tools work everywhere, and they never let you down. Human boarding operations continued throughout the system. A pattern began to emerge that terrified the Zephyrian command structure. These humans did not fight like any species the collective had encountered before. They moved through zero gravity like they had been born in space, adapted to any environment within minutes, and solved problems with a combination of skill and determination that seemed impossible. On another captured station, human soldiers were setting up defensive positions using nothing but salvaged materials and their own ingenuity. They turned broken wall panels into armor, converted alien tools into weapons, and established communication networks using equipment that should not have been compatible with their systems. Kolvek watched all of this with growing understanding, and finally spoke the words that would change how the Zephyrian collective viewed these strange aliens forever. They don't fight like they have better technology, he said, his voice filled with awe and fear. They fight like they've been fighting forever. The realization spread through the Zephyrian ranks like wildfire. These humans had not developed advanced weapons or sophisticated defenses because they had learned to survive without them. Every human was a born warrior, shaped by countless generations of conflict and struggle. The last stand of the Zephyrian collective took place in the shadow of their greatest achievement. Zephyr Prime hung in space like a jewel, its surface covered with gleaming cities that had never known war. Around the capital world, the final remnants of the collective's military might gathered for one desperate battle that would determine the fate of their entire NTU. Civilization, Admiral Heian stood in his command center, surrounded by displays showing the approaching human fleet. His forces had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength, but what remained represented the most powerful weapons the Zephyrians had ever created. Experimental energy cannons that could tear holes in space, itself, reality warping devices that could turn matter into energy with a thought. And most sacred of all, the guardian artificial intelligences that had protected the collective for over 1,000 years. "Activate everything," Admiral Hayne ordered, his voice heavy with desperation. "Use every weapon, every defense, every secret technology we possess. If we fall here, our entire civilization dies with us." The space around Zephyr Prime erupted into chaos as the collective's most advanced weapons came online. Beams of pure energy lanced out across the darkness, each one carrying enough power to destroy a small planet. Reality itself began to twist and bend as the Zephyrians activated devices that could manipulate the basic laws of physics. The very fabric of space-time rippled like water as weapons that existed more in theory than practice were brought to bear against the human fleet. Admiral Minho watched the display of alien firepower from the bridge of his flagship, the UES Determination. The ship had been battered by weeks of fighting, her hull scarred by countless impacts, and her systems held together by the skill and determination of her crew. Around him, men and women worked at damaged consoles, their faces grim but determined. As they prepared for the final assault, Sir reported his tactical officer, "we're detecting energy levels that are off the charts. They're using weapons that our sensors can't even classify." The first wave of exotic weapons struck the human fleet with devastating force. Ships that had survived the entire campaign simply vanished as reality-warping beams erased them from existence. Others were torn apart by energy weapons that seemed to ignore the laws of physics, their hulls melting like ice under a blowtorch. Any other species would have retreated in the face of such overwhelming firepower. The logical response would have been to withdraw, regroup, and find another way to achieve victory. But the humans were not like other species, and logic had never been their strongest trait when it came to warfare. "All ships," Admiral Minho announced over the fleet communication system, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them, "continue the mission." The human fleet pushed forward through the hellscape of twisted space and devastating energy. Ships were destroyed faster than their crews could send distress signals, but the survivors kept advancing. When their weapons were damaged, they used improvised solutions. When their shields failed, they relied on armor and determination. When their navigation systems were scrambled by reality-warping effects, they used visual references and dead reckoning. Commander Siajin, aboard one of the surviving human vessels, watched his ship's hull temperature rise beyond safe limits as they pushed through a field of pure energy. The metal was beginning to glow red-hot, and the crew was working in environmental suits because the air itself had become too dangerous to breathe. "Hull integrity at 30%, reported his engineering officer. "Keep us moving," Siojin ordered. "We're not stopping until we reach the planet." The Zephyrian Guardian A is ancient digital minds that had been protecting the collective since before most species had discovered fire turned their full attention to the human fleet. These artificial intelligences could process information faster than any biological mind and had access to weapons that could reshape matter at the molecular level. They had never failed to stop an enemy, and they brought all their accumulated knowledge to bear against the humans. But the humans had something the eyes could not understand or counter: the absolute refusal to give up. Every time a human ship was destroyed, the others kept coming. Every time their formation was broken, they regrouped and continued the attack. Every time logic suggested they should retreat, they pressed forward instead. Admiral Han watched in growing horror as his most powerful weapons failed to stop the human advance. The reality-warping devices were draining massive amounts of power, but only managing to slow the enemy fleet. The Guardian A's were reporting that they could not predict human behavior because it did not follow any rational pattern. "How many ships do they have left?" he demanded. 12 vessels still operational," replied his tactical officer. "But they're all heavily damaged. They should have withdrawn hours ago." The final moments of the battle came when the last Zephyrian defense platform fell silent, its crew evacuated, and its weapons offline. The human fleet, reduced to a handful of battered ships, took up positions around Zephyr Prime. They had not won through superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They had one because they simply refused to stop fighting. Admiral Haon sat alone in his command center, staring at the tactical displays that showed human ships orbiting his home world. With trembling hands, he began to record his final log entry. "Should have been defeated," he spoke into the recorder. "Our weapons were superior. Our defenses were impenetrable. Our technology was beyond their understanding. But they kept coming, absorbed losses that would have broken any other species, and kept advancing. Their defense was impressive, but Earth was unstoppable. The war was over, not because the humans had destroyed their enemy, but because the Zephyrians finally understood what they were facing.